My name is Andrew Shikiar, lead marketing here at FIDO Alliance. It's great to be in Seattle. I did grow up here. It's my hometown, so that gives me license to complain about growth and traffic like any other old-timer in Seattle. How many of you are familiar with FIDO Alliance? How many are not familiar with FIDO Alliance? Okay, good. So that's a good baseline for us. This is the point of the presentation where I usually ask how many of you like passwords, but I'm not going to do that, because usually there's some snickering and one person raises their hand. But instead, let's kind of just look at the numbers at hand and look at the problem with passwords. So consumers have a password problem, right? We can all relate to that. They're clumsy, hard to remember. They're supposed to be changed all the time. This is one of the big usability problems with passwords. And you'll see different statistics depending on your source, but in general, they're all pretty glaring and pretty bad. So the average user has 90 plus accounts. Right? For those of you in this room, you probably have 200 plus accounts. And they're managed with usually less than 5 passwords, right? Because passwords are hard to use. And most haven't changed their password in their past 5 years. As a result, you see things like only 32% use a unique password per site. And those unique passwords, by the way, are not strong passwords. They'd be things like, website name 123, website name, my name, kind of weak passwords which can be easily hacked, even more easily than a more complex password, which can also be hacked. And collectively, this is causing problems. So every day it's estimated that humans around the world spend 1,300 years every day entering passwords, which is a lot of time to be spent frustrating yourself. I can think of a lot of other things I'd rather do with my time than enter passwords for that length of time. So that's a consumer problem. Businesses have a problem as well. And let's look at a couple aspects of this. First of all, there's a risk aspect. Passwords are the Achilles heel in any sort of system. They're the cause for the vast majority of data breaches. 81% of data breaches were caused by weak credentials. And they lend themselves to phishing attacks. Right? So here you see a stat from the Verizon Data Breach Report that 1 in 14 phishing attacks were successful in 2016. We saw a really great presentation yesterday from Google, who, based on their data, says that a well-crafted phishing attack, so not your Nigerian prince kind of thing, but a good one, has a 42% success rate. So not a click-through rate, but success rate of someone actually getting phished. Right? So the phishers are getting smarter, they're getting more sophisticated, and they're getting more successful. And as a result, we see a growth in phishing, we see a growth in data breaches. There's also hard costs associated with passwords, right? So there's the management cost, which many of you are probably attuned to. The vast majority of help desk calls are associated with passwords. A large organization spends around $1 million a year in password resets, right? So there's the internal costs, and then there's the loss costs, right? So roughly half of shopping cart abandonment instances are due to login problems or password problems, right? So that it's costing more money, and there's lost revenue opportunity due to the password problem. So a lot of this comes down, and by the way, I'm sure over the next 2 days you'll see more statistics like this, and the common theme is passwords suck, right? We need to come up with a better way of doing this. What I want to stress today is that a big part of the problem is the approach that we've always taken to authentication, which is centralized authentication, where you have a centralized server that has shared secrets, symmetric secrets, that stores the passwords, stores the username credentials. That's a risk, and that's a problem that's leading to all of these horrible data points. So our friends at Shape Security do a great report every year on credential spills, and there's a lot of very interesting data in there. And it starts with the fact that there's 2.3 billion credentials were stolen in 2017 alone, and that's a big number, and it's hard to think about sometimes, but what's the real impact of these 2.3 billion? And sometimes you can get numb to it, but if you harken back to like the Yahoo data breach, for example, think about the real cost there. So anyone who had a Yahoo ID stolen, odds are there's nothing of that much value of a Yahoo property that was at risk, right? Worst thing could happen is maybe someone mismanages your fantasy football team. But the real risk is actually people stealing those credentials and then stuffing it on other sites. And so credential stuffing is a huge problem. That, again, comes back to the fact that there's centralized authentication stores where people are stealing these credentials and using them in massive numbers. Right? So there's over 130 million stuffing attempts in retail alone each day. And in fact, if you look a little closer at this, over 80 to 90% of e-commerce sites' attempted logins are stuffing attempts. So the vast majority of attempted logins are illegitimate logins. And even worse, there's up to a 2% success rate. All right, so you can do the math here. So you're looking at over millions of invalid logins based on stolen credentials every single day. And there's a real cost to this. Right? The real cost is around $5 billion per year to U.S. businesses. All right, so that's a very real cost, associated with stuffing, which all stems back to the fact that these credentials can be hacked, they can be available, and this is what we're trying to change at FIDO Alliance. Looking at password issues a little bit more graphically, this is how passwords work. First of all, this is a usual login scenario where a user uses a device to log into a server. The password is stored on the server. The username credentials are stored on the server. Even if you have a complex password, even if you have a hashed password, that can be hacked, right? And if you can't hack the hashed password, you can brute force it and guess someone's password, right? So if you know the top 1,000 passwords that are out there, I think you have around a 60% chance of logging in. If you know the top 10,000, you have a 98.5% chance of being correct, right? So there's a lot of ways to get around passwords in addition to flat out stealing them. Additionally, passwords lend themselves to phishing, right? So we talked about phishing a little bit, but if you have a password-based authentication and you have this simple symmetric relationship between the user login and the server, it lends itself to phishing through apps or on the web. And then we have the usability issues, right? We already talked about the fact that password reuse, shopping cart abandonment. Then also there's kind of the usability issue on devices, right? So on a mobile device, who likes typing passwords on mobile devices? No one. Better yet, someone pointed out yesterday, typing in a complex password on a remote control on your TV is living hell, right? So the usability factor for passwords is another major challenge. So obviously, people have known that passwords are a problem for some time, and there's been solutions, there's been improvements. So traditionally, the way to improve passwords is to do an OTP, one-time passcode, which is certainly better than a password, but also has its own faults and its own shortcomings. So, one of these is that OTPs are still vulnerable to phishing and man-in-the-middle and man-in-the-browser attacks. All right, so OTPs can be spoofed; they can be knocked off. Secondly, especially on a mobile device, they're also very insecure. Right, so whether it's through social engineering or an SS7 hack, mobile OTPs via SMS can be manipulated as well. And so it's little wonder that NIST, for example, in their latest digital identity guidelines, deprecated SMS OTP as a means of strong customer authentication. And then coming back to the user, as we all care about here, of course, there's usability issues too, right? So the traditional OTP tokens, they're expensive. People don't want another device. They're not very consumer friendly. And inside the enterprise, you have the classic kind of token keychain scenario where you have a network admin who has a literally keychain of OTP tokens that are all bespoke, one each for each service that they're logging into. So they don't scale very well. And then you have the same device input issues that you have with passwords, right? So the more sophisticated the device that you have to enter an OTP into, the harder it is, whether that's a mobile phone, tablet, or something else. If you're getting a notification on your device, entering in that device is no easy matter. So what's the solution? So on this graph here, you see in the bottom half there, we have passwords. They have reasonably poor usability, really low security, and above that, you see OTPs have much better security, but even worse usability. We want to be in that holy grail. We want to be in the top corner with a simpler, stronger approach to user authentication, and that's what FIDO's doing, right? So FIDO is an industry answer to these problems, and what we're doing as an industry is creating open standards for simpler, stronger authentication using public key cryptography. That's a single gesture, phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, right? Which is a fancy way of saying it's easy to use with a single motion. And underneath, there's a lot of strong protections and cryptography to make sure that everything's done fully securely in a phishing-resistant way. So FIDO was launched in 2013 with 6 board members. We've grown to have over 250 companies around the world. Shown here are FIDO's board of directors. It's an interesting chart, lots of good companies. Here you see we have consumer electronics vendors, security vendors, and people who deliver services. Another way of looking at this chart is if I asked one of you in this room, and I said, hey, look, we have to crack this password problem. What types of companies do we need to have sitting around the table to help solve this problem? And the collection of logos you'd come up with probably look a lot like this, right? So people who produce devices and platforms you use every day, specialists in security and biometrics, and perhaps most important, the businesses who manage billions of identities, whose very businesses depend on, or delivering high assurance services to consumers, and who need to have stronger, simpler authentication to have a low friction way of securely authenticating their users. So that's, these are just the board directors who are leading the FIDO Alliance, and there's dozens of other members representing leaders in government, telecommunications, finance, and IT. FIDO's focus is quite narrow, right? So we only focus on the authentication layer in the identity stack, user authentication, basically trying to move beyond passwords. Since our focus is narrow, we happily partner with other organizations to help give us broader reach into adjacent market spaces and adjacent geographies. So you see a lot of other identity groups here. You see adjacent markets like the Connectivity Consortium, and also we do a lot with regional groups to help get the word out in different parts of the world. Another thing that we've had success doing as an industry is engaging with government and getting positive feedback from government. So way back in 2014, NIST, who's a member, the U.S. government's a member of FIDO Alliance, the NIST guidelines back then identified that it's okay for technology to have two secure distinct authentication factors in a single device. That's basically the FIDO UAF approach, where you can have two factors in one motion, in one device. The Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity cited FIDO as one of the best models moving forward for user authentication. Senator Wyden down in Oregon is one of probably the top congressional champion on matters of cybersecurity. Without any direct engagement from FIDO, he wrote a letter to bank regulators asking for support of FIDO U2F last year, and then last year also, NIST's latest digital identity guidelines, 863-3, cited FIDO authentication as meeting the new AAL3 requirements, the higher level of requirements within that document. Outside the U.S., we've seen a lot of engagement as well, right? So there's a lot of regulations, as we know, in Europe and Asia. The UK government has been tracking FIDO quite closely. In fact, you can use a FIDO security key to log in and secure your UK digital citizen services. But they cited FIDO as a future to replace passwords way back in 2016. The EBA with PSD2, many of your companies, if you're a merchant, have to deal with PSD2. We've engaged directly with them as an industry body, and they've noted that they accept, similar to the US government, one device serving as two-factor authentication. In Asia, we've seen a lot of adoption. Asia is a really interesting area for FIDO. A lot of these countries have had very advanced digital ID schemes that were put in place in the early 2000s that are now being replaced by more modern authentication schemes. So they're basically looking to evolve their PKI infrastructures for citizen identity into something more modern and vendor neutral. And so you see a lot of adoption there. We have two data points here, one in Taiwan, where they cite client-side biometrics as being appropriate for e-banking applications. In Korea, where over 70% of the banks use FIDO authentication in Korea. KISA embraced FIDO as part of a broader, more modern and vendor-neutral approach to authentication. Likewise, in Hong Kong right now, there's an RFP out for their citizen EID schemes, which specifies FIDO support as part of that implementation. So we're seeing really strong embrace and adoption by government and regulatory bodies worldwide. So a little bit about how FIDO works. At very high level, the key concept here is an introduction of something called the FIDO Authenticator. This is a secure area of your device which will store your private key, and the public key is stored on the server, right? So what's not on the server are your authentication credentials or anything unique to you. That takes away the server as a hacking target for hackers because there's no central credentials to store. Through the challenge response mechanism, there's a lot of added measures put in there to prevent phishing, to assure that there is a one-to-one match between your authenticator and the website that you're authenticating to. So FIDO is phishing resistant and prevents man-in-the-middle and man-in-the-browser attacks as well. All of this is manifested in FIDO specifications. So we have two user experiences that are covered in our specifications. The first is a passwordless experience. This was first manifested in our FIDO UAF specifications. Again, it's 3 steps where you're presented with authentication challenge. You do user verifications through a single biometric gesture, and and then you're authenticated online or in that app. The second factor experience is where you are still using a password, but using a strong second factor to prove presence of yourself. And again, in 3 steps, you can be authenticated online using the second factor experience. So that was called the FIDO U2F standard as well. More recently, we've introduced what's called web authentication from W3C, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So WebAuthn came to be when FIDO partnered with W3C to contribute 3 technical specifications into that working body to create the WebAuthn working group and the WebAuthn specification, which was finalized, well, near finalized, and came out this spring in April. And the net effect of this is that this approach for strong user authentication is being standardized in the web platform and in the web, and also being sedimented into leading operating systems and operating environments. Within W3C, there's strong participation from all major platform providers, and what we've seen is already that the leading browsers now support WebAuthn and through that FIDO authentication in leading browsers from Microsoft, Google, and Mozilla. In addition to web authentication, the FIDO2 specification includes something called CTAP, Client to Authenticator Protocol, which is basically an extension, if you will, of U2F that allows you to use either an external authenticator as a second factor to log into your device, and also the new use case of using, say, your handset to authenticate to your PC or to your desktop. So these are the FIDO2 specifications. There's basically a web browser, web platform component, and there's an external authenticator component to it. And this is FIDO2, and this is where we're seeing a lot of industry gravitation around as the 2 key platform stakeholders in FIDO, both Google and Microsoft, are bringing this into their respective platforms of Windows and Android. So stay tuned for news very soon about the first FIDO2 certified products, which will be coming on market in the very, very near future. Speaking of certification, it's all good and well to do specifications, but I like to say that specifications without certification is like one hand clapping, right? There's no way to verify that these things are being used correctly. So FIDO has a very robust certification program. At the core is our functional interoperability testing. So this verifies that a product conforms to the FIDO specifications and also interoperates with others in their specification suite. Right, this is very important for those of you who might be thinking about deploying FIDO authentication as part of your own infrastructure, to know that if you find a FIDO certified product, it will interoperate with others in your stack. So this program has grown dramatically. We have over 475 certified implementations to date. Next week, we should be announcing our first FIDO2 certified products. Additionally, we've introduced something called certified authenticator levels. So FIDO certifies servers and clients and authenticators. The authenticator could be a roaming authenticator, like a security key, or it could be something embedded in your mobile device or in your desktop. With these gradient levels of security certification, it allows a relying party to specify that the authenticator meets these specs. And in general, we have 3 levels. L1 prevents against large-scale attacks. L2 prevents against malware or operating system compromise, and L3 prevents against actual physical hardware attacks, meaning that the chip is, the authentication credentials are fully secure in that chip. And then last but not least, we are introducing something called the FIDO Universal Server. This is a very important concept. This is for a relying party or service provider that wishes to make sure that their site can authenticate any FIDO authenticator, any FIDO credential. So Universal Server can basically interoperate across FIDO's full range of specifications. And we think this will be a best practice for anyone who is deploying FIDO authentication as part of their identity scheme. So the FIDO certified ecosystem is growing. I mentioned that if you are rolling out implementation of FIDO, you can look for different products and services on market that support the FIDO specifications. These include devices that you use every day. These include like the phones, PCs, and browsers. So very important that your end users will likely have a FIDO compatible device, whether that's one of these devices or a FIDO security key. That market is growing. Recently, Google announced that they're shipping their own security keys, so the Google Titan security key. And then there's also back-end server-side solutions. What's interesting about that third column over there is that these aren't just solutions coming to market from companies like Knock Knock Labs, but also this represents large service providers who have rolled their own FIDO implementation, like ING and Bank of America and MasterCard, but they're going through certification to make sure that their servers can interoperate with the rest of the FIDO ecosystem. Otherwise, there would be a risk of them having some sort of bespoke FIDO implementation that might not fully interoperate. So we're seeing a really strong engagement on the certification front from both product vendors and implementers. And this is where it all nets out, right? So these people who are actually deploying FIDO today. And this is really past the testing and pilot and POC stage. This is really becoming the mainstream best practice. You see a lot of logos up here. This really is a fraction of people deploying. A couple anecdotes. So we see Google in the top left corner. Google announced a study recently where they deployed FIDO security keys to 85,000 employees inside the company over, I think, a 4 or 5 year period, and not one of them was phished. Right, that's super compelling. That's why they're actually going to market now with their own security keys. In the bottom there, you see BC Card. BC Card's a Korean payment provider. They've gone to market with a biometric payment platform that allows anyone to validate payments with either voice or face. They're doing over 1 million authentications a day, using the FIDO protocol. So this is all very real. Additionally, you see T-Mobile, Intuit, eBay, Bank of America, PayPal. These are all apps on your mobile phones right now that are using FIDO authentication under the hood. So this is all very real and happening today. So to wrap up, FIDO authentication, FIDO Alliance is really the industry's response to the password problem. I can't emphasize industry enough. This is, FIDO is, by the industry for the industry. It does represent the efforts of some of the world's largest brands, who are utterly dependent on better user authentication. A key thing to think about also is that the specifications we've created, the industry has created, represent tens of thousands of development hours, right? So these are lead engineers from some of the brightest minds in identity, authentication, security on the planet working together to actually put these specs together. And we continue to innovate, right? So the specs continue to evolve, the certification continues to evolve, and more importantly, it's interesting yesterday, a lot of the conversations were about the practical considerations of rolling out user authentication. So as FIDO as a body evolves, more and more of our effort will be focused on deployment best practices, pulling relying parties together to understand what policy considerations there might be, and kind of really looking at those business challenges as well. And then enablement, right? So we continue to work with service providers to enable their authentication processes to make sure that they have successful FIDO deployments. So with that, if you want to get involved with FIDO, you certainly can. We welcome new members. We have open communities. If you have questions around how to deploy or get certified, let me know, or visit the resources I have on this page. So thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
I've got a question, and then we'll go to break.
Okay.
So the universal server, will that be, and I think I know the answer, the universal server, will that include any multi-protocol STS from FIDO to create SAML assertions or claims or things like that for other downstream systems?
So we test interoperability just across against the FIDO authenticators and the 3 protocols.
Okay. But vendors are free to build that kind of functionality into their product. One question before break?